Good evening. That was loud. My name is Cleve Corner. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement at the Pratt. I appreciate everyone coming out. Is it still raining? Oh, that's good. It's a little concern. Couple things real quick. Lydia and Elizabeth are going to have a 45-minute conversation, and then we have time for about 15 minutes of Q&A. I have microphones on each side of the aisle. If you could address your question to the microphone, it would be appreciated. We have a large virtual audience as well. That way they can hear the question. After this discussion, Lydia will be outside signing books. Our on-site booksellers are Greedy Reads, so please buy a book, have it signed. Don't get a library book signed. We won't take it back. I've done that joke for 6 months, and every time there's a nervous laugh, and it makes me happy. And you've been here for it, and it's almost embarrassing that you've heard it that many times. Finally, I have to say this because I'm proud of it. We now have free parking here at the Pratt for our author programs over at the Franklin Street Garage. If you park there after 4 o'clock, come in, I'll give you a free voucher. It's $5, but it's free. So when I took over this gig 6 months ago, everyone said, there's no parking, but I promise I'd be there otherwise. Well, now there's free parking, so I don't want to hear it. Tonight, I'm happy to welcome Lydia Millet to the Pratt for a discussion of her new novel, Dinosaurs. She's the author of over a dozen books that include Love and Infant Monkeys, I've tried that a couple times, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and a children's Bible, a finalist for the National Book Award. She's also an editor and staff writer at the Center for Biological Diversity. In Dinosaurs, Gil, a man recovering from a failed relationship, walks from New York to Arizona. Once there, he resides next to a glass-walled house that blurs the line between his life and his neighbors. Christine Smallwood for the New York Times Magazine called Dinosaurs a new phase of Millet's career. The spaciousness of the style makes a sense of loss richer in the questions posed. What constitutes moral action? How best can we help one another? At once simpler and more profound. Millet's great insight, why her writing matters so much right now, is that looking outside the human is what gives human life its meaning. And Kirkus Reviews wrote that Dinosaurs is another life-affirming work from a writer who always carves her own literary path. This evening, Lydia Millet will be joined in conversation by writer and editor Elizabeth Dickinson. Her work has appeared in several publications, including the Washington Post Magazine, the New York Times, and the New Yorker. It's my great pleasure to welcome Lydia Millet and Elizabeth Dickinson.
Thank you for coming. Hi.
Yeah, thank you for being here on a rainy night. Although the rain did stop.
It's pleasingly rainy, but maybe folks from around here don't see it that way.
Do you want to start with me asking you some questions, or would you like to start by reading something from your new novel, Dinosaurs?
I think we could start with a couple of comments, questions, comments. Yeah.
All right, let's do that.
Conversation. And then I'll read a little bit, not for long, don't worry. Just like 3 pages, 4 pages. Yeah.
So congratulations on, this is your 13th novel, your 15th book overall?
Is
Can
that
you keep
true?
track?
I don't know. It depends whether you count the ones that I've written for children and one for teens, which I generally don't sort of admit to.
You don't admit to the children's books?
I don't really, I don't like to bring it up.
Is it?
But I just did, so.
Let's dive into that deep, dark secret. Why don't you want to bring that up?
Oh, I don't know. I think because no one read them, so I'm going to say like 5 people read some of them.
Well, I want to get into children and the topics that you write about in general as well, because as a parent of 2 kids, people have read your novels quite a bit. I know that Cleve probably talked about the accolades, the finalists for Pulitzers, the finalists for National Book Awards, a fan base, I think, that really loves your books. And, one of the things that happened this week is you had this lovely profile in the New York Times Magazine where they really did this retrospective on your work. And the writer called you a climate novelist. And I'm curious if you would call yourself a climate novelist, if that's the way you think about your writing.
No.
The danger of headlines, right? Like they're sort of reduction.
Well, I mean,
of,
it's fine for her to have, or for whoever wrote the headline or whatever to have done that. It's a nice shorthand for things. But no, I think, for one thing, I've only come to climate recently in my fiction directly, because for many years I wrote more about extinction, and I still do write about that. I've never stopped writing about that, but about creatures and our love of creatures and and the suffering that we cause them also. And so climate has always been harder for me to write about because, before everyone was doing it, now we all seem to be doing it because we can't avoid it because it's ambient and omnipresent and hard to turn away from. But back in the day, it often seemed such an abstract structural thing to be trying to write about in the context of fiction. And yeah, I was afraid of it. I mean, I was afraid of it. I am afraid of it. And it seemed easier and more immediate and charismatic and personal, really, to write about the creatures and the plants and the trees and the natural world. Although I'm certainly not a nature writer either.
Well, you told a story that was covered in that profile in the New York Times Magazine about being a kid and stepping on a toad.
Yes.
I'm sort of interested in what brought you to this relationship with animals and with species. Like I think all kids and all humans have some attachment, right, to animals, but you seem to have a relationship with them on their own terms that's rather unique. And you write about it beautifully in your novels, and I'm curious how you got there.
Well, I mean, I really do believe that most of us grow up loving animals and being aware of our love for animals, and it's sort of trained out of us as we get older. And we're told that we need to compete with other people, and we enter this sort of paradigm of, anthropocentric achievement, and are told to leave behind childish things, and the beasts are childish things. I think in our culture, sort of are relegated to that. It's like even just as teenagers, we maybe we throw out our stuffed animals, or our parents kind of make us in certain situations, or give them away, or just stuff them into the back of the closet, and all the things and the imagery and the iconography of animals that have adorned our lives until then, in the schoolroom as in our bedrooms, sort of disappears and is replaced by images of people, right? Celebrities, musicians, rock stars, actors. I had Clint Eastwood on one of my closet doors and young Elvis on the other. So we all of a sudden switched to this sort of, we no longer can adore the animals. We now have to adore the people.
That's interesting.
Sort of how our life proceeds.
Yeah, well, so your short story collection, Love and Infant Monkeys, from 2009, that was shortlisted for the Pulitzer, a finalist for the Pulitzer. In that book, you had this interesting construct, right, where the stories were this combination of celebrity and animal, and I remember reading a amazing imagining of Madonna on her pheasant farm, pheasant hunting, and that whole book really was about sort of juxtaposing this idea of celebrity and the famous animals in their real lives, but then you were putting this into the world of fiction.
Yeah. In that book, I sort of I took nonfiction accounts of famous individuals and sort of found, in case it's anecdotal or some sort of evidentiary basis for writing about them in the context of like an episode that occurred to them with an animal. So it was sort of based on fact, and then, the lies were on top of the fact.
Right. I remember David.
The lies we call fiction.
Yeah. Who was David Hasselhoff? David Hasselhoff had some sort of.
David Hasselhoff.
Yeah. He was one of the characters in there.
Right. It's true. Just a very glancing David Hasselhoff encounter. Yeah.
So with dinosaurs, you have a protagonist named Gil, and the novel opens with Gil going on what I would call a geographic cure. He needs to leave one place and get to another because of, we learn throughout the book, heartache and a breakup. How did Gil start, I guess, talking to you? Or was it Gil who was the person that you saw first in this book? Or I'm curious how you kind of start with a novel and what gets you going into the
Well, I like that you just made me think of, by saying, you made me think of the Western cure and like Teddy Roosevelt and like manliness and how one might go out west and cure one's neurasthenia or the perceived ill of, I guess, effeminacy in the case of Roosevelt, and become macho through the Western cure, which is not what happens with Gil. It doesn't really have a sort of masculinity hang up exactly. He does feel sort of he has forms of sort of inadequacy in his life that he has to reckon with. But I guess like in this case, it was usually I just start a book with a sentence, and it's really simple, and I don't usually know where I'm going, and it's just like what makes it fun to write them is to discover where I'm going as I do it. It's pretty uncalculated. And in this case, I wanted to write, I was partly inspired by by elements in my actual life, which is not usual for me with my fiction. It's usually just totally made up, I mean, it's like not literal events or people from my personal experience, usually just, amalgamations. But in this case, my boyfriend had moved from New York to Arizona to be with me as Gil moves across the country, actually to be by himself in the book. And also Aaron, my partner, had just walked the Appalachian Trail.
Oh, interesting.
The whole Appalachian Trail right before he moved from like Crown Heights to Tucson. So he'd made this like 2,500 approximately, 2,000 some mile journey.
So Gil, the character in your book, it opens with him deciding to move to Arizona, and he does so by walking. And
yes, which
much
is not,
to the
not how I arrived there.
Yeah,
so.
Which is much to the surprise of, I think, anyone who knew him. And later, as he's trying to explain it to his neighbors, who he becomes good friends with, what prompted him to need to leave New York and get to Arizona by way of foot?
Yeah, so he's someone who has inherited so much money that he never has to, even though he gives, philanthropically or whatever, he never has to pay for anything. He never has to sacrifice anything for anything. I mean, so, that's kind of the thing when you have as much money as this kind of character does. Nothing has a price because there's never a trade-off. Nothing has any kind of trade-off value. So money is like, it's in a sense doesn't exist when you have that much of it, because you never have to pay for anything when you have this amount of wealth that he has. So he wants to sort of feel what he's doing. He's kind of, he's quite alone and bereft and wants to do something in his life. And the only way he knows to pay for things in any real way is with time.
Yeah. It's interesting because Gil is very wealthy. I mean, in your mind, is he a 1%er, or he's up, maybe not a Bezos or a Elon, but he's up there in his money.
Right. He's definitely not like those guys.
But he's very wealthy. He's
not
set.
like the rest of us. Yeah.
And he got that money through tragedy, in that he was left quite young, orphaned quite young, and was raised by a grandmother. But what's interesting is I think we're living in a time where not a lot of people want to spend time with wealthy people. You know what I mean? That we're sort of at this era where I don't think we have the moral imagination to want to think about what it feels like to have too much money, or to be a kind person with an inheritance that we're not sure what the weight of that inheritance means. Mm-hmm. And so, socioeconomics is a theme that shows up in your work. You see it in a children's Bible, your 2020 novel. that was a National Book Award finalist, and that book looked at a superstorm. And there's this moment where the character in that book is really talking about the rich, the yacht rich, the people who have the ability to have bunkers and escape a climate disaster, versus her and her parents who are wealthy, but in no way capable of, escaping to some, private island. And I guess with Gil, it's interesting. He's such a empathetic character, but I'm curious, like, what made you want to spend time with someone who's wealthy?
Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah, there was a very bad review. I don't know if I'm supposed to say this at a publicity event, but a really bad review of this book in the Washington Post by Ron Charles, where he sort of asked, why on earth would any of us want to spend narrative time with this rich white man? And it's a perfectly fair question. I really didn't approach the character demographically, and I never do. I just approached through voice, and this is where I ended up with this particular version of interiority. But I also kind of wanted to have like a bookend experience to one I had when I was much younger, when I wrote a book called My Happy Life, which was the first time I was able to kind of step out of the snarkiness of my 20s, of who I sort of was in my 20s, and as a writer, and probably as a social being also, and into like this kind of space of empathy and generosity that I now find more interesting, a dwelling place generally, which is not to say I'm not snarky anymore, because I'm still snarky.
You're still the Duchess of Gen X,
right,
as the New York Times Magazine called you.
Right.
What's interesting though is, like Gil has empathy. Like Gil is a very sensitive soul in a lot of ways. And I think that what's interesting about him as a character is that it's that notion, I think, in America too, that we have this belief that money solves all problems. And in a lot of ways, money is the source of some of his disconnect from like knowing himself and knowing the people in his lives. And so we're having this moment of Gil kind of understanding who he is and the losses, while being told his entire life, you're okay, you're rich, you're fine, what's the problem? Right. And so you have this very kind of sensitive soul who spends a lot of time with the birds in his backyard in Arizona.
Yeah. Yeah, so the notion of this book is, like, just in a nutshell, is that he moves and he ends up living beside a family whose house has one wall just made of glass. So he's looking in to their home and seeing them sort of as you would see like doll figures in a dollhouse that's split open, or characters moving around on a screen. This one, and so like it started out kind of as a story about really sort of the disappearance of voyeurism by dint of its omnipresence. So the disappearance of the sort of voyeurism as a marginal or perhaps criminal or surreptitious act, and its enshrinement as like the mainstream of our culture, where we're all voyeurs, so none of us are voyeurs anymore. So that was sort of what it first was about, this sort of the simplicity of just like watching other people, and how we, sort of how we do that all the time now. We're constantly on display, we're constantly watching. And so it's no longer even really possible to be a voyeur in some basic sort of like ontological way.
Yeah.
It's something that we've all taken on and sort of like morphed into, are these constant watchers, right? The culture of watchers. So anyway, it sort of started with that idea, and then became actually a slightly less chilling book than you might imagine based on that. It turned into a warm book.
Yeah, because you can do chilling. You've done chilling.
Yeah, it's not a chilling book.
Books like that are very
right.
thriller-like in their delivery. And so the breadth and delivery and the scope of your work really evolves and moves through each. Like there are certain, I think, characteristics, of course, that you can say, well, that's your book. But with each book, you really do sort of reinvent the way in which you look at something or look at someone. And from a really wonkish, I know we have some writers in the room, so from a very wonkish craft question, one of the things that's always interested me is point of view in a book and how you start to hear the characters talk and how you know the point of view that you want to take. One thing that you do very well in point of view of time is you're able to sort of telescope us out and in a lot. So even with Gil, as he's in the Arizona desert looking at the birds, you've got a book called Dinosaurs that sort of relates us back to the source of those animals. And so we have almost this ecological time in your books where you are able to remind us that we're walking not just on desert sand, but we're living amongst creatures and botany that's been around a lot longer than we have. And with Gil, it's sort of interesting because what is it, a close third, the book? It's like the literal point of view and the way you tell it, which is, some of your books are first person, some of your books are third. How, I guess, do you decide the delivery of how you're going to let us into that character? Is that a conscious choice or does it just happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there is some level of conscious choice between first and third because there's such different ways to write, and first allows for this first person, the I, and it allows for this kind of infinite subjectivity and I think greater sort of distortion in the narrative voice and stuff. And that's really fun. Sometimes that's an adventure. And then if I'm telling a sort of straighter story, like a more literal story with a more reliable point of view, slightly more reliable, I would do third person. So there's some level of rationality in it.
Yeah.
But it's also just sort of what feels right when you write your first page.
Yeah. And it's interesting because in this book, we're sort of getting to know Gil as he's able to get to know himself a little bit. There's like these dangling carrots of what happened in New York that made you come here. What happened with the family that sort
like
of led to
small,
these,
dispersed bits of information or whatever. I am sort of more, and I think we as a culture, we're developing this whole new lexicon of terms related to climate, to the climate crisis and the extinction crisis. And some of them seem kind of awkward and made up, and others seem kind of natural and sort of organic products of language. Right now, there's that website, I think it's called the Bureau of Linguistic Reality. Have you ever?
No.
It's a kind of, it's art, but it collects these different new words that are derived from different sources. About some are portmanteaus, sort of like epoquitude, for example, which I don't think falls trippingly off the tongue necessarily, or solastalgia. Well, that's not exactly a portmanteau, but basically, I guess it is. It's just made of different languages. But epoquitude being that sense of that sort of consciousness of deep time, and sort of it imagines a future in which perhaps human beings are not present or are less present, but is also brings solace to the imaginer because they know that others will still be alive, or that the earth will still be alive in some form. But that's apoquitude. Anyway, there's a whole lexicon of these really interesting, and I think that's because certain of us, many of us, maybe even, think more now about deep time than we used to, and sort of evolutionary time, and because things are changing so rapidly.
Right. You can't help but think of deep time as like glaciers start to sort of shave off.
Exactly.
You start to think about one of the things that's so striking about your work with as it relates to the animal world is that you have these ways of talking about species that are not in any way anthropomorphizing them or putting human character on them, but just reminding us of the beauty and truth of species as their own thing, animals as their own thing. And there's this one moment in here, I was talking to you about this earlier, how I loved how you wrote about a turkey vulture, right? So a turkey vulture being this thing that we all sort of see as this awful, kind of gross, ugly creature that, inhabits the sides of roads. And you write a turkey vulture. Like the ones he'd, meaning Gil, seen on the long walk. People looked down on them as carrion eaters, but they were the peaceable recyclers of the dead. And you have just these beautiful moments laced through your writing that remind us to look at animals and other species for what they are, not as human metaphor.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that makes me think of. One is how, like, over the course of deep time, various features have evolved and seem to re-evolve, like compound and simple eyes, right? That have disappeared from the record and then reappeared and stuff. But we don't know, or I don't know, someone correct me if they do, of any species that has ever recurred after, so it has re-evolved. So species are these singular creations of epic time. That's one thing. And what was the other thing? I don't know. I don't remember.
You'll remember.
Yeah, it'll come back to me.
Do you want to read a little bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Maybe
I'll remember what I was going to say.
Yeah.
At some point. I'm sure it was a gem.
It was
a gem, y'all.
I'm sure it was.
I'll just read about 3.5, 4 pages, something like that. And this is not the very, very beginning, but right near the beginning. For weeks after he moved into his new house, the glass one next door was still up for sale. Curious, he'd taken a break from arranging furniture to go to a showing. It was a mid-century modern masterpiece, the real estate agent boasted, though technically built in the 90s. From his place, you could see most of its interior except for the bedrooms and bathrooms. It was laid out in an open plan: entry, living area, dining area, and kitchen. On the side facing his house, the wall was one long stretch of glass. On the other side, in the bedrooms, there were regular picture windows. He was the only neighbor with a view of the glass-walled stage. He'd asked himself who would choose to live there on display. But he was still getting used to the air and silence of his house, older than the glass one, with such spacious rooms and high ceilings that he thought of it as a castle, when a family of 4 took up residence there: a husband, a wife, a girl, and a boy. He lived by himself, so it was hard not to look at them. At first, they seemed like a group of mannequins to him in a high-end department store window, say Bloomingdale's or Saks. Maybe privacy just mattered less to the family, he thought, than what you could see from within. The glass wall was equipped with remote-controlled screens. The realtor had shown him their quiet movement that rolled down to keep out the heat, protecting the house from the desert summer. At the end of a hot day, you could press a button if you liked and raise the screens again. That way you could watch the sun rise in the morning, and in the evening, from the windows in the west-facing bedrooms, you could watch the sun set. At night, the indoor lights made the glass house into an even brighter theater, its colors and figures vibrant against the surrounding dark. The parents were slightly younger than he was, he guessed, late 30s or early 40s, possibly. The woman was blonde and wore her hair up in an elegant roll when she went out, taking it down with one deft hand at the back of her neck when she came in again. The man was tall and had chiseled features, a sweep of black hair on his high forehead, olive skin. The little boy was his father in miniature, and the teenage girl resembled her blonde mother. One afternoon, he noticed the wife moving around in the kitchen. It was a cloudy day, and the screens had been raised. When he sat down to read a book in his favorite armchair and looked up from the page, he could glance through a gap in the drapes of the window beside it and see the full sweep of the open plan. Idly, he watched her stretch out the end of a roll of silver foil, rip off a neat sheet. She covered something in the foil, then gestured to the children, the boy who sat building Legos at the dining room table, and the girl who roused herself from a couch in front of the TV. The 3 of them went out their front door, the wife carrying her foil-wrapped plate, the children lagging. They walked down to the sidewalk and turned toward his own front yard, then up his front walkway. For a second, he felt trapped, not ready for a meeting. He looked down at his feet. One sock had a hole at the big toe. But they had to know he was home. His car was parked in the driveway. If his car was here, he was here. Phoenix was built for cars, like LA. You barely moved without them. Buying a car had been his first act when he arrived. In New York, he'd never needed to own one. They rang the doorbell, so he shoved on his shoes and went to the entryway. On the screen of the security console, he could see them. The wife smiling up at him, the tops of the children's heads behind her, indistinct. Damn, was his thought, and he felt his pulse quicken. Alarm, but also a sliver of anticipation. It had been a dull sequence of days. And he opened the door. The wife, who was even more elegant up close, said what friendly neighbors said in TV shows from the 50s. It was a peach pie. She hoped he liked it. She was a mediocre cook, but when it came to baking, you just followed the recipes. Plus, her daughter had helped. She liked to make desserts. Her name was Ardis, the children were Clem and Tom. Gil said his own name and stiffly shook hands all around, stooping to reach the children. They were awkward, not used to handshaking. It wasn't a thing, he realized, with kids. Maybe you weren't supposed to shake hands with them these days. Then he accepted the pie, said thank you, and stood there holding it, a man who had received an offering. Was he required to ask them in? He thought not. The kids wouldn't want to hang around. We won't keep you, said Ardis. He was supposed to utter a protest manners dictated, but his lips didn't move. Thank you again, he said finally. It looks delicious. This is very kind. It should have been the other way around. I should have thought of it myself, brought you flowers or something. Not used to the neighborhood yet. I got here recently too. Not at all, honestly, we just needed a project. Well, I appreciate it. Another person would have asked questions. As soon as they were gone, he'd think of some. For now, nothing occurred to him. He was a deer in the headlights. You have a lovely home, he ventured. Oh yes, so do you. That was established now. They both had lovely homes. They'd bought them with money. So that's where I'll stop.
So one of the things I love about that scene is you capture so well, like the racing heartbeat of a doorbell or even our phones ringing, like how distant we are now from like basic acts of social humanity. That,
No,
like,
and actually,
someone coming to the door is terrible.
this first draft, this was like written before the pandemic and first draft, and then I revised it during lockdown and afterward and stuff. And I actually had some, I had kind of the opposite neighbor experience while I was revising this.
You did.
Yeah. I had, so basically, well, first of all, I have, out where I live, I have two neighbors that directly abut my land. It's kind of in the, it's out in the desert. It's not, things aren't close together, but they are my direct neighbors. And they both like shoot off guns in their yards. And so you don't feel like necessarily.
Like you want to go visit?
It's a disincentive to go over there and be like, my name's Lydia, like when it's no trespassing and,
I also hate guns.
Well, I'm also very intimidated by your projectiles. So one morning I was like sitting at my breakfast table eating eggs, and there's a like window there that looks out over my like solar panels and stuff and out, but there's no road there. It's just like the desert. And I looked out and saw this like glint of like red metal, like there was a big machine like moving right where like there was no road. And anyway, it turned out my neighbor had just like bulldozed like a whole bunch of my property. He just like bulldozed a lot, like a fair amount of cactus, and it was just like the wild part of the desert. And my boyfriend went over to talk to him about it in a friendly way. And he just was like, oh yeah, no, I didn't know where that property line was. But he wasn't like sorry or anything like that. Like we were just like, well, maybe you could have come over and just done a little chit chat before you broke out the bulldozer.
Well, and that's fascinating because like one of the repeating characters or areas of that you write about is development. Like you have like one of your short story collections is basically loosely tethered by a real estate agent.
Yeah.
You have books where real estate developers go into dark like that's a character, like that idea of development of land. And real estate seems to be something that interests you.
Yeah, I'm of two minds about about, because I also am really fascinated by like real estate and people's houses, and like, you know, I did watch Selling Sunset with my daughter for a couple of episodes. You know, I'm kind of fascinated. I mean, I'm in particular like infill type houses where, you know, just one house is built where there previously was another house, or there's like old neighborhoods, is what I'm more drawn to in that world, not like
Bulldozing
news
actual
sort
habitat.
of like cookie cutter. So yeah, I'm not as interested in that, obviously, but I am really, yeah, I have this like, and I also have like a chronic, fear of developers also.
Is part of that like, well, part of that I think is the characterization of like developers are like some developers are interesting characters in real life. But you've also worked for 19 years now at the same nonprofit where you're helping to save species that are on the verge of extinction. And so what is affecting extinction rates around the world? If not, a lot of it is, we just had this wonderful visit at the Maryland Zoo. Thanks, Mike. Today, where we got to walk around the zoo. And one of the stories we were hearing was one of the conservator vets. Am I getting that right? Is she? Yeah. She is working to save these Panamanian dolphins. Thank you. No, the ones in the
But
rivers,
also the dolphins.
The dolphins that are basically dying because of development of soybean plantations. And so there's this interesting like dynamic that we were talking about today, which is what we're all like struggling with, which is how do you look out for animals and, you know, develop a farm? And, you know, there's these conflicting notions. And so I'm curious if that sort of also feeds into your thinking of development and real estate in terms of the work that you've done in saving endangered species.
Yeah, I mean, there have been, there are many people in the real estate world that I hold in high esteem, but also at work, we have gone like head to head with development interests from time to time, and continue to do so. And there are a lot of pretty complex and subtle issues involved there, obviously. Like, you know, for example, we all need lithium, right? We need it for our devices. We need it for electric cars. And, but we, where I work at the Center for Biological Diversity, also strongly believe that those types of things that we need for new technologies, and many among them green and renewable sort of technologies, should not be extracted where it's going to drive a unique kind of life extinct or whatever. So sometimes we're actually almost in the position of fighting the good guys, and it is quite, you know, subtle and complex at times. And there are sort of trade-offs. We believe that extinction should never really be a price we agree to pay willingly. But yeah, there's nothing simple about the quandary in which we find ourselves right now.
Well, and interestingly, speaking of zoos, you know, Gil is a character who effectively is like, it's almost like a domestic zoo. Like he's able to watch this other family behind this encasement of their house.
Yeah.
And then outside, and so he develops this rapport with them and this friendship and this relationship with the son. But he's also noting that out in the desert, somebody, who he hasn't identified until later in the book, is shooting birds and shooting animals illegally, because there are rules that allow for certain types of hunting. But in this case, he's discovering that someone's shooting the animals. And so he goes to great lengths. I love, can you explain what he does?
Well, he does. He just begins sort of like going out at night in sort of ninja gear and trying to catch this person in the act. I mean, like all clad in black and stuff.
And like night vision goggles.
Indeed, which are really uncomfortable and hard to use.
Have you worn them?
I have tried. Yeah. I mean, I think you have to, maybe if I were like a Navy SEAL, you know, I would have it down. I don't know.
You're also one of the few people I think I know who, we were at the zoo today and you got enormously excited about a salamander. Like there was a moment where
a hellbender.
You were like a hellbender. She was so excited about the salamander.
Yeah, we work on these guys, and famously, you know, as it even says in the interpretive display, they have other names, not as even less beautiful than hellbender. I kind of like hellbender, but like snot otter is one, which just seems cruel. Like, why call an animal that? That's very disrespectful. But it's kind of funny. I mean, they're not like, classically beautiful, maybe, as many other salamanders are. They're kind of, I don't know how many of you have seen the hellbenders at the zoo here. But they're endangered, and we actually work on them directly. We've worked on this species for a number of years. So for one thing, it was the first time I'd ever seen a living version of this thing that I've worked on and written about for years, on whose behalf we have done much science and much litigation. So that was exciting. But yeah, they are really just like lumpy, mottled creatures. Like so many salamanders are truly beautiful, like just delicate, wonderful. The hellbender is a different beast.
Yeah. And we got to
only a mother could love. Maybe.
Only a mother could love. Speaking of being a mother, you just sent your oldest daughter off to college.
Right here in the neighborhood.
In DC. She's down in Georgetown. And you have a 9th grader. And I'm just curious, I know a lot of you in this room have read a children's Bible because we've all talked about it, because it was a book that stuck with many of us, where, it's being narrated by a teenager. It's a summer vacation with multiple families. It feels like The Big Chill entering like a horrifying superstorm. And the parents are just described as basically they get drunk and I think take some drugs while the superstorm is happening, and the kids are sort of left to figure it out, because on some level, like many of us, we just want to be in denial. And what a lovely denial. Just, as they were preparing for this storm, they were more concerned about like restocking the bar.
Yeah, they got those big liquor bottles from Costco.
Yes, they had the handles. They're like, no, you need the handles.
Right.
But I'm curious, you write so well about the teenage perspective. You've written children's book, like you have the capacity to sort of put yourself in that age. How do you talk to your own kids about these things, about the bulldozing neighbor with the guns, about what's happening? As a parent, I struggle sometimes to find the language.
Well, I will say that it's a bit odd because since their father, my ex-husband, runs this organization that I work for, the Center for Biological Diversity. And he's really very full-time, more than full-time, 60, 70 hours a week, always working on this. Like it's his mission, to stop critters and plants from going extinct. He really is someone who's completely mission-driven. And then I write my books and also work on it 30 hours a week, right? So the kids have been raised just in this, it's just all around them.
They're steeped
sort of, they don't really they don't want to hear about it. And they haven't read, for the most part. I think my daughter, who's 18, has read a couple of my children's books, but generally they haven't read any of my books. And
are they interested in reading your books? Or are they like, no?
Well, apparently not, I would say.
That's like, I don't need to read her book.
Well, also I understand too, because like you don't want, certainly I don't want to like browbeat them into reading my books. I hope that one day, perhaps after I perish, they will read them. That's what I'm hoping. But also, it's weird to read books by people and sort of have them hovering beside you as you read, and especially a parent, like it's a terrible thing to make a child read your books. Anyway, but I do hope they will someday read some of them. But so anyway, the answer is just like, I don't talk to them that much directly about it. It's all just kind of
how you live your life,
osmosis, and and they're really quite on top of these things in many ways. But my son is very aware that, he sort of puts it, he's obsessed with skateboarding, but he actually thinks that the only, in a way, righteous thing to devote his life to would be something climate. It's just that he's compelled to skateboard all the time. But perhaps later.
Skateboarding now,
climate later.
Saving the world.
Right. What's he going to do now? It's
He's what, 9th grade? Not a lot.
Yeah, but also I think you just get sick of activists if you're around them too much. If you're a kid.
Well, and I think again, this is that beautiful empathy building of a novel. So what's interesting to me is the dichotomy of your life, which is, you spend your 30 hours a week trying to humanize stories about animals that are dying, or that we're killing or making extinct. But then in your novels, it's not preachy. You walk away from one of your books feeling kind of more gracious and attentive to the world around you. I find that after I read one of your books, I notice things more. And so on some level, what I find is that empathy, it's that empathy building of just how to pay attention and how to see things fresh.
Thank you. I mean, that's great. That's great. I appreciate that. I mean, I think some of my books have had sort of more space for the reader in them than others, and I also feel that the longer I live, the more interested I am in the sort of white space where the reader can exist, and the less interested I am in just sort of like a forceful cascade of myself.
telling us how to feel. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up for all of us to talk, because we're a small group and we can just have a conversation. I always am fascinated, as many of us are, about like just the act of work and when and how you write. And I read in the New York Times Magazine profile that you have to work for a certain amount of time in the morning, and then you go to work, and then you have to write for a certain amount of time in the evening, and that if you don't, you get cranky.
I mean, that's a paraphrase.
That's a paraphrase.
Yeah.
But tell me, I guess, about like that idea of many novelists, many writers of your caliber are in academia or are in sort of like these specific, you're a unique kind of model for a writer in that regard.
Yeah, I really love the job that I do during the day, and academia seems, to me, for myself, less compelling than that work. Even though I'm really just like I'm such a peon at work, I'm in a certain way. I'm not the boss of anyone, and I wouldn't want to be after all these years. I mean, I first went to volunteer at the center
because you had gotten a degree
99. Yeah, I had a master's degree in this field, but
in environmental management.
It was called that. Yeah, pretty wonky sounding. But I just couldn't. I didn't actually want to do like policy white papers or something. I wanted to be kind of as on the ground as I could be, but also in this country. I decided I wanted to stay in this country, which I hadn't always known. And now I forget where I was going with that.
Well, it's just that whole idea of like how you, manage your time.
Time management. Right. So right now I have it's a luxury to be able to. For many, many years, I couldn't. I just had to fit in my books around press releases and, 15-minute periods of writing between things in my day job, because it's kind of a fast turnover job where most of what I edit and write is going out to, the public. And sometimes usually has to go pretty quickly. And then because I have a partner now, he's able to help with, like right now, my son's breakfast, or he'll actually drive him to school for me and stuff. So they have an hour to work before my day job starts at 8:30. So I feel really fortunate. And then I get to write again for about usually, an hour and a half or so at night. And that's definitely all I need. Like that's a lot of writing time for me.
And you've written a lot of, I'm just like fascinated by it, because it's just amazing. Is it every day? Because it's just that consistency of showing up.
Yeah, it is kind of every day. Yeah. Like I don't like a vacation.
Yeah.
I don't like to take a vacation from writing. It's not a vacation.
Because you feel.
Because that's what I love doing most. So I don't, I mean, sometimes you just have to, on a logistical level, not do it. But I prefer not to. I prefer to always do it. Yeah.
I know a lot of Lydia readers and people who love her work. So I would love if anyone, and if you want to just stand up and talk loud. Do you need the microphone for the recording? I think?
If possible, if folks could come to the mic. We have about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So if you could come to the mic, that'd be great. So the virtual audience can hear your question.
And I can, get up there, Mike. Go do it.
I
think there's a proclivity for people who write about animals to be thought of as spiritual. And I don't know that that's always necessarily the case. You strike me as someone who's pretty finite about things that, you know, when something's dead, it's gone. How do you feel about that? I mean, would you characterize yourself in that way?
Well, that's not a question I get very often. Thank you for that. I'm actually writing sort of a whole book, a nonfiction book about those kinds of matters right now, and sort of like just having children in the age of extinction, and also sort of how the book is sort of about having been someone's child, and then having been a parent, and in this particular age of things going away. But it also is a lot about how certain kinds of like religion have shaped our extractive sort of use of the natural world, and our sort of reduction of animals into objects, or into things that we value for utility rather than intrinsic good and beauty. So it's a lot about actually the kind of, I don't know, it is somehow really about that, the kind of mysticism of like otherness. Like I think more and more over time about how important it is to have the unknown in the world with us, things we don't know, like things that we can never know, things that are beyond us. I don't think that we would thrive in a world where everything was known. And like the animal, sort of other animal subjects and plants. And when I say animal, like I mean the beasts, but I also mean trees and plants and fungi, and actually everything in the living world. We need to have like the mystery of their otherness to remain human, to be any version of the humans that we've evolved to be. These creatures that we've co-evolved with over such a long time really define who we are. And so I think a lot about the importance of not knowing, the importance of our own finiteness, and of there existing a world outside the limitations of ourselves.
It's interesting because one thing I noted when I was Googling you, I said that preparing for a talk like this is a little bit like stalking somebody, right? So I'm like, hey, you know how Google autofills? One of the things that autofills is she religious? Like there's an autofill where it asks this question because, but I think it's one of those things that's right. You tap into this notion of the natural world. And like you looked out that we were having a conversation on the way here. She's staying at the Indigo right across the way, and looked out at Mount Vernon and noticed the Dawn Redwood. If you are familiar, we have one of the largest Dawn Redwood trees that exists in Mount Vernon, and it's this magical tree. And just that you're the person that takes the photo to capture, to send home, and says, wait a minute, that's an extraordinary tree in an urban environment. What is that? Yeah. And then we like geeked out over our love of the identifying plant apps.
Various apps like Merlin and Picture This.
Yeah. But yeah, that idea of, even today as we're at the zoo, we're looking at African penguins, and these penguins are endangered. And the Maryland Zoo here is really interesting because they have this conservancy. And even as we're talking about them, we got into this interesting dialogue about not even giving human emotion to like penguin behavior. How do you read this penguin? And the keeper was telling us these great things about, well, when it turns its head, it literally is curious, which is kind of what we humans do. It sort of does this, and it really is like a body language of curiosity.
Yeah.
So in that case, it does map how we are, but oftentimes we're trying to map our humanness onto the animal.
Right, and I think the mistake we actually make is not actually to do that. I don't really think that's the worst mistake. I think the worst mistake is assuming that which we are projecting onto them is humanness. I think we're both or all partaking of some other thing, humans as well as other animals. And it's very arrogant of us to suppose that we have some anomalous, unique access to things, to forms of emotion and stuff like that. It's just kind of, it's pretty ignorant.
You know what? Our opposable thumbs made us like very jaunty. We think we're like
the opposable
really good.
thumbs, yeah.
Like we just think we're better.
Fantastic. It all turned out really well with the opposable thumbs.
Does anybody have any other questions for Lydia? Cleve, how are we on time?
We're good. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So-
Thank you for coming, everyone. Thank you so much.
So happy to have you. And now you'll be outside signing books.
So very quickly, I want to thank Lydia and Elizabeth again for a wonderful discussion. Greedy Reads is outside selling books. Lydia will be out there in a moment to sign your books. Please purchase a book and have a chat. Thanks again for coming out.
Oh, can I also just say thank you, libraries?
Oh yeah.
How much
no,
do we
no, 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 no. We
like-
refuse to accept that.
I mean, I still walk into a library and I think there's this magical place that will answer all of my dumb questions, the poor person behind the desk, and that gives me free stuff I can take.
Those people are amazing. I'm
it's
not a
magical.
librarian, but I appreciate
Yeah.
all the people who work.
So thank you, Enoch Press.
Yeah.